Our speaker this morning is Emery Lazar. Emery Lazar is one of the founders of this congregation. He's currently approaching his 90th birthday and lives in beautiful Rappahannock County. He is with us today via Zoom. This morning we will hear a story from his childhood. Emery writes, "This story is a recollection of my childhood at the age of 7 in 1944, when I spent some time in a small village in Csókakő, Hungary, to escape the bombardments of our home in the city of Budapest." Emery composed this story as part of a Rappahannock writers group he established. As Kathy Lyons said to us last Sunday, his conviction was that all our stories are important. I can't think of a better idea. Today, Emery's writers group still exists, and it's called Emery's Life Stories.
Csókakő is a beautiful little village at the foot of 𝘓𝘳𝘳𝘰 mountain. It is tucked away from the main road, and the top of the mountain proudly displays the ruins of a medieval castle built in the 13th century. It seemed to make perfect sense to find refuge from the war in this remote little village. Our hosts, Elek Bognár and his wife Ilona, lived at the edge of the village on a dirt road that led to the mountain. Elek bácsi, Uncle Elek, was Csókakő's blacksmith. He practiced his trade in the shop located adjacent to the house. The equipment and technology employed in this shop were pretty much the same as one can find in 17th century colonial Williamsburg. I still remember the foot-operated leather bellows that was used to pump air to the glowing pieces of iron which Elek bácsi hammered into their desired shape. But most of Elek bácsi's work consisted of shoeing horses. There was not a single car or tractor in the village. The farmers used either horses or oxen to perform their work. This was my very first encounter with life in a village, which was a far cry from what I had experienced before in suburban Újpest. My mother, brother, and I were allowed one room allotted one room of the farmhouse, which had no electricity or running water. We pumped our water supply from the well in the yard, and for sanitation there was the low-tech but always reliable outhouse. Bathing was accomplished by the use of tubs filled with well water. Window screens had not been invented yet, at least not in Csókakő, but there were numerous strips of paper with an adhesive bait, probably molasses, hanging from the ceiling to catch the flies. These fly torture instruments had to be replaced virtually on a daily basis because the supply of flies in the outside air was inexhaustible. The horses and cattle in the village also attracted horse flies, and they were more than an annoyance. Their sting was most painful. 𝐿𝐬𝐵 néni, Aunt Ilona, had one cow in the stable, which provided me with the first insight of how a cow is milked. Csókakő had a communal cow shepherd who herded all the village's livestock to the surrounding meadows for grazing every morning. It was an amazing sight to observe the cows as the herd was passing through the village in the evenings. Each of these creatures recognized her home and knew exactly at which gate to turn into the barnyard. Such superb geographic orientation still exists already several decades before the invention of the global positioning system, the GPS. Csókakő also taught me how animals reproduce. 𝐿𝐬𝐵 néni had a cat, and one day this pet surprised me by giving birth to a litter of kittens right in front of me. Before that, I had no idea how this natural phenomena occur. I guess I had been sheltered by my mother from the facts of life, and in those days there was not even a source of knowledge like Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers available to a child. I also learned about chickens and their relationship to roosters, and about cows and bulls. One thing I did not enjoy to find out was where the chicken paprikash came from. It was a routine occurrence for 𝐿𝐬𝐵 néni to chase after one of her chickens, hold her between the knees, and slice her throat with a kitchen knife. These were shocking and bloody scenes, and it took me a while to enjoy again my mother's chicken paprikash. In my adult life, I feel much more at ease being a vegetarian. We must have arrived in Csókakő sometime in May 1944 because the school year was almost over. Yet my mother enrolled me in the village's elementary school to finish out the first grade. I'm quite sure I attended school there for less than a month before the onset of the summer vacation. Although I have few memories from Csókakő's elementary school, I do remember attending Mass at the Roman Catholic Church on Sundays. Church and religion were most important in my mother's life. She was an exceptionally devout Catholic and had seriously considered becoming a nun before marrying my father. A complicating factor was that my father had to be baptized and raised as a Protestant. He belonged to the Calvinist Reformed Church, the second largest denomination in Hungary. The only way my mother was willing to marry him was by staying in the good graces of the Catholic Church. In order to accomplish that, he was required to sign a reversal, a solemn vow to raise all offspring from the marriage as Catholics. Since my father was very much in love, he did not have a serious problem with signing that document. Nevertheless, I believe that my parents' diverse religious heritage did present some difficulties in their long marriage. One of these rough spots occurred during a weekend visit of my father to Csókakő. We all went to Sunday Mass together, and on that particular occasion, the priest happened to deliver a hostile sermon directed against the Reformation and Protestant religions in general. My father was quite incensed and my mother embarrassed. They talked to me about this unfortunate happening years later. Csókakő and the surrounding region is known for its extensive viniculture. Just about every farmhouse had a wine cellar, and the children in the village have the reputation of enjoying wine even before being completely weaned from mother's milk. Therefore, it should not come as a surprise that I became drunk for the first and only time in my life at the age of 7. It happened on a hot summer day as I was playing with my new friends in Csókakő. One of the boys carried in his pocket the key to his father's wine cellar, to where we all proceeded to have some refreshments. After some hours of strenuous play, we quenched our thirst with several glasses of delicious homemade wine. This innocent enjoyment did not faze my friends even a bit, since they had already developed a healthy alcohol tolerance during their infancy. But the effect on me was quite scary. Within a short time I became very ill with a severe headache and began to vomit. When my mother saw me in this condition, she was scared out of her wits, particularly because my friends at first didn't dare to tell her what had happened, what had precipitated my sudden illness. According to reliable witnesses, my face was pallid and my lips were blue. When the truth came out, it brought some relief for my mother, since there was hope for my survival, even though I may have had a tough alcohol poisoning. One of my most pleasant memories from Csókakő consists of enjoying there the most delicious fruit that one can find anywhere. I remember particularly the juicy and fragrant peaches, pears and plums that were so plentiful in the village. Also, I have some pleasant olfactory experiences from frequenting the meadow near the Bognar's house. To this day, whenever I smell the fragrance of certain plants or cut hay in an open field, I am reminded of my childhood days in that village. Csókakő was a very small village between 800 and 900 residents at the time that I lived there. Almost all of them were farmers who eked out a difficult livelihood from the land they cultivate by cultivating their fields and vineyards with manual tools such as scythes and horse-drawn plows. Aside from the blacksmith Elek Bognar, there were a handful of other tradesmen, and the sole business in the village consisted of a grocery store which was owned by Jenny Grünfeld and his wife Rosa, who were the only Jews in the entire area. The village intelligentsia consisted of 3 persons: the priest, the teacher, and the village administrator. In our age of computers and instantaneous telecommunication, it is difficult to imagine that in my own lifetime I regularly witnessed public announcements delivered by a town crier. He gathered his street audiences by the use of a drum that hung from his shoulders. I no longer remember what the announcements were about, but they must have been important because they drew large crowds. The other means of mass communication was pealing the church bell, but that was used mostly to remind people to perform their prayers and come to church. The church steeple also housed a small bell with a tiny voice that was only when someone died in the village. It was called the 𝘓𝘳𝘳𝘳𝘠, soul bell. Although we lived in a tiny and isolated village and were spared the bombardments, we were reminded daily that the war was going on. There was a small contingent of German soldiers who marched through the village regularly, singing ear-catching songs that I still remember today. Heide Marie, wenn wir am Rhein marschieren, Heide Marie, when we march on the Rhine, and auf der Heide blüht ein kleines Blümelein. On the heath there is a little flower blooming. Together with a horde of other children, I used to follow the soldiers to the meadow at the edge of the village where they performed the drills and exercises. They even assembled machine guns with tripods in the grass, but there was no shooting. Another reminder of the oncoming war was the vibrating roar emitted by several dozen of American warplanes flying across the sky almost on a daily basis. The mission of these was to bomb the oil fields of Ploiești in Romania. The squadrons always flew at very high altitudes and in perfect formation, with several planes sticking together in one group. They were so high up in the sky that from the ground you could only discern many small silver dots that were often followed by spectacular white contrails. These warplanes flew largely unchallenged over Hungarian airspace, but on one occasion we heard that an American bomber had crashed in the 𝘓𝘳𝘶 mountain and that there were no survivors. There is a Catholic tradition to hold the religious procession in late spring on the holiday of Corpus Christi, which is celebrated on the Thursday following Trinity Sunday. In these processions, the priest, accompanied by a number of altar boys, carries the Eucharist in a gold receptacle under a canopy, baldachin, carried by men dressed in their Sunday best. In rural Hungary, these processions stopped at various religious way stations that were located along the road outside of the village. My mother, brother, and I were in such a procession on Corpus Christi Day 1944. We were already outside of the village when a horse-drawn carriage approached us from behind. It was driven by gendarmes who were taking Jenny and Rosa Grünfeld to the railroad station in the adjoining village to be deported to a concentration camp. I was too young to understand what was going on. I was only aware of the gendarmes with the trademark rooster feathers sticking out from their hats and the family sitting in the carriage amidst their meager suitcases. But in my adult life, my mother retold me the story many, many times, particularly about feeling so ashamed that she looked down on the ground so as not having to look the Grünfelds in the eye. Although she did not know that they were being taken to their deaths in Auschwitz, it was obvious to her that a horrific injustice was being perpetrated. My mother was ashamed, the more so because this was a religious procession and she was able to view the situation from the vantage point of the victims, who for sure must have looked upon these pious Christian people with rightful contempt. At the start of the new school year in September 1944, we moved to the adjacent village of Bodoj, where we were able to rent a place that had a room with a separate kitchen, running water and electricity. In 1966, a time when U.S. relations with the Soviet Union had thawed a bit, it was the beginning of the détente period in Cold War politics. I went back to Hungary for the first time since we had escaped in 1945. When I revisited Csókakő, I was sad to learn that Elek Bácsi and Ilon Lady were no longer alive, but a number of villagers still remembered me. They told me that in the final days in December 1944, the village was at the epicenter of the fiercest battles in the region, and it changed hands several times between German and Soviet forces. Today, with the help of the internet, one can easily obtain documentation on the horrific sufferings inflicted by the war on the residents of Csókakő. The village has its own website that lists each of the military and civilian casualties of the war by name, some personal data, and the circumstances of their death. Out of a population of a little over 800 souls, 22 men were killed in action while serving in the Hungarian army in the Second World War, and there were 46 civilian casualties. 18 of the civilians were summarily executed by Soviet soldiers, including several women after being raped. The documented civilian casualties include the Grünfelds and several children who died shortly after the war from playing with unexploded ordnance. 72 residential houses and the Catholic Church were completely destroyed in the prolonged siege of the village by the opposing Soviet and German armies. So much to be said about being safe in a remote village during wartime.
Well, Emery, thank you very, very much for letting us hear that. It was a remarkable historical and human document. And thank you, Gary, for the pictures. They were wonderfully placed as well.